Let's get rocking and rolling. I can't remember if I recorded last week. I really hope I did. Okay. We have very little to finish up in this, so we're going to get her all done up here. So, at the end of class of what feels like eons ago, we were finishing up what it means to be a vertebrate. And really, ultimately, we were talking about diversity within our vertebrate groups. Okay, so we had talked largely about our different classes within this heading, right, that had the 6 upgrades within the vertebrates. And really, we just want to know, who are these groups? Who are these classes? Okay, so we're big picture settings. And what kind of diversity should we expect within them? All right, so we talked about our fishes, both Chondricthyes. Remember that chondr means cartilaginous, and the ichthyes, right, meaning fish, and Osteichthyes, bony fish. And Chondricthyes we found was our least diverse, while Osteichthyes was our most diverse. We also got to practice some very serious Latin with these kinds of beasties. Remember, Actinopterygii, Actinopterygii. And we're going to practice that one a bunch again, so no stress. Okay, we also had talked about amphibians and reptiles. These fell somewhere in the middle, and this is where we're going to see most classes fall, kind of in this 5,000 to 9,000 range. This is pretty normal. Okay, not surprisingly, we saw amphibians were a little bit on the lower side, right? This having to do with their thin, wet skin, allowing them to absorb everything around them. While that's generally air and oxygen, this also means pollution. Okay. We also were given the chance to be introduced. Let's not use black, that blends in with my text. To some additional subgroups. Right, so within class Amphibia, we had subgroups. In this case, we called them orders. Right, so frogs, salamanders, right, and eyeless salamander nightmares. And we ended off seeing for reptiles, which were a little more familiar to us. Okay, but same thing, a little more diversity, a little tougher species, right, because they have that armor plating. And we also had subgroups in here. Turtles, crocodiles, and alligators, and pretty much everything else. Or normally what we think of as being reptiles, right? Snakes and lizards. Okay, I think this is where we left off on Friday. Is there anything about anything that we talked up to this point that we wanted to clarify before adding the last couple groups? So we only had a few groups left to talk about. Okay, Aves, certainly being one of them. So largely our warm-blooded mammals and birds, anything warm-blooded. Birds, of course, being anything adapted for flight. So we've taken scales, modified them into feathers. Okay. And again, we're much higher on the diversity scale here. Okay, very similar to reptiles. We won't see anything in the hundreds again. So Chondricthyes is going to really be the smallest as far as diversity goes. We're not going to see anything in the 25,000 range again. Our Osteichthyes, our bony fishes, is going to be the highest. Okay. Aves, like our fishes, does have a variety of adaptations. When we talk about these, that we're ultimately going to end up talking about what are the different adaptations for flight, and we will talk about how to recognize birds a little bit, but we won't talk much about the subclasses because there is a lot of variation on a theme here. So the last one I want to talk about is class Mammalia. We will, of course, end up talking about these guys quite a while because mammals. Certainly that's of core interest to us because it's what we are. And there is actually a little bit less diversity here. And some of it has to do with us. We're not so great to ourselves. So habitat destruction and things like that has a lot to do with this as well. Still not as bad as fish and amphibians, though. So there are 3 major subgroups in this one. We'll spend a lot of time talking about these. Now that you've all had lab, these are also quite familiar to you to some degree. So within the mammals, right, so we talked about in lab, what does it mean to be a mammal, right? So things like fur, having of a mammary gland, and we'll review this, of course, when we talk about mammals way at the end of the semester. So all of these organisms have all of those things, but as we talked about in lab, mammals get real weird. Right, we're kind of a weird group in, quite frankly, a lot of ways. But even within us, we diverge quite dramatically in the rest of the stuff that we do. So within our subgroups, this is how we're plotted up. So our Prototheria, or the way we talked about them, the monotremes, right? The echidna and our platypus, or our platypus was our mystery animal in lab, are pretty much, right, remember proto, being early, think prototype. Okay, so these are pretty much our early mammals. So both echidnas, and since we didn't get a chance to see one, this is what an echidna looks like. Not so much like Knuckles. Little creative artistry when it comes to that. Okay, but all mammals that lay eggs still have fur, still produce milk and all that business, just also weirdly lay eggs. Okay, then we have Metatheria. So this theria end is what's telling us that there's mammals. Okay, so meta is like almost or mostly mammals. There's no bias here. So these are our marsupials. These are organisms that are going to give live birth. We're getting rid of the whole egg business. But we're still doing weird birth, at least to what a true mammal is going to be. So this is our pouched mammals. Kangaroos, koalas. This is a wombat, on the off chance you've never gotten to see a wombat before. Okay, if you're from North America, it's very likely you have not gotten to see one. Okay, if you've seen a possum, okay, a possum is also a pouched mammal, so if you're from here, that's probably the one you've gotten to encounter. Okay, the big key here is they're giving live birth, but they're basically giving birth to a fetus, quite literally, very small, teeny animal, okay, that crawls out of the birth canal and into the pouch. And that's the key behind the pouch, where it's going to finish its development into the much larger size offspring that we're used to actually seeing, right? A baby kangaroo, we imagine, looks like this. There's my camera. Okay, quite large, right? Maybe half the size of an adult human, okay? But it's born the size of your thumb. Okay, so that's the deal with the Metatheria. So that leaves us with Eutheria. U is the prefix for true, just like we saw eukaryote, true cells. Okay, so there's all of our mammal bias showing. We name things as true because it's the way we are, and we think it's the right way. Humans. Okay, the key here, though, is realistically what we mean by true is placental. These are mammals that are using a placental for their babies so they can keep them inside for longer. So they stay attached to mom, mom feeds them, the babies can grow much larger, okay, and more fully developed before they're born. Okay, so each set of these, of course, has a different set of advantages and disadvantages that we'll talk about much later. But these are how these different groups are separated. So we can think about These are the features that are creating these categories, or keeping these groups of animals together. Okay, that finishes, what am I touching? Stop. That finishes off our introduction. Any questions about any of this?